Okay, there we go. Hi, so thank you for coming to the panel. I think we'll start with one of the questions that was given to us, and then we'll kind of open it up to the audience to ask some questions. I'm going to ask this one based on the results of the survey. It turns out most of y'all don't use serverless in production, but you want to, or you have plans to. So the question is, what do you think the biggest hurdles are for this technology to overcome to be widely adopted by large businesses like security, telemetry, et cetera?
Well, I think the promise of serverless is there, right? So the ability to get that velocity to deliver your code as fast as you can. But I think there's still a lot of inconsistency in the developer experience, right? So it's not just the runtime of your code, of your functions, but also the dependent services and the use cases, the patterns there. So I think that's probably the biggest hurdle right now is you can learn the concepts, you can start to run with them, but the larger solutions aren't there to go completely serverless, get all that benefit just yet, but it will come.
One of the things, I'm working with a large financial institution in Toronto, and they're really looking heavily at Lambda. And the problem they had was that the data that flows through it needs to be stored like kind of as it's flowing through the functions. And doesn't have the same level of auditability and compliance that the other parts of Amazon AWS has, like SOX and Basel and all these financial regulations. And so they're like, it's almost a non-starter for most of the applications because they just, some data stores on Amazon have those, some don't. So that's a big one, is that you don't have because all the stuff's pre-wired, you don't have as much control over it, and therefore I think there's going to be a lot more on the, flexibility and bringing your own data service and having your own auditability and security requirements.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to agree with that point. Also, being in the same space, it's been a big concern with a lot of the financial clients we work with. So the biggest use case we see right now is it has to be transient in nature. If it's going to go in the cloud, the data can't stay there. And if it's PII kind of information, maybe that's another blocker in that case. So yeah, it's definitely a big issue.
Yeah, one other thing I see is like the most ironic thing, which is cost controls. If you look at like Google BigQuery or Amazon Athena, to like serverless big data processing things, and people are like, so you're telling me I don't know how much I'm going to pay at the beginning of the month. It's just like a random cost that can just spike to $1 billion, and it's just like, where does it stop? So it's like, well, can I like make it slower and cap it at $1,000 per month? And like right now, it's kind of hard to do that. It's the ironic, like, it's too freedom, right? And a lot of bigger companies are like, we're gonna lock it down. So there's that too.
Yeah, the wireless one doesn't seem to want to work. So let's take a question from the audience, if anyone has a question for our panel. Don't all jump at once.
Hey, that's my turn.
Yep, I know. I'm stealing it because it's late and I can't think of another one.
I'm going to start with a question.
Okay.
So we have this panel here of great folks across the industry from all different platforms and tools. Mm-hmm. We've seen how different kind of technologies in other contexts have at some point consolidated and created some sort of a schema or a standard that consolidates all these kind of practices and tooling. Do you all foresee something like that happening around the serverless world, whether it's a cross-platform, not a cross-platform? I know Darcy's shaking his hands there. It's kind of one of the things he's doing. I would like to see your opinion. Is that an industry-wide concern that at some point perhaps we'll have a official standard, just like we have the HTTP standard or something of that sort?
I don't know. I think it'll be controlled by the web standards that already exist, like the idea of REST APIs, the JavaScript having its own standards board. I think it's more governed by the technologies that are used on it, but I'm sure the other panelists have.
Yeah, it's a great question. Standardization in particular. So the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, they govern Kubernetes and a bunch of other projects. So we have a serverless working group that we've started up. I think at least Chris from Amazon and several other people from different industries. We're not trying to define standards, right? So we want to help define a vocabulary, how people can talk about this, how people can share patterns, but it's explicitly not top-down. This is what a function is, this is the spec, this is what an event source looks like. I think we want to see what are the successful use cases? What is it great? What's it used for? And then kind of build from there, kind of what the industry is doing rather than, forcing something upon it. Because it's so early. You really can't quite tell what you're going to do with it. Well,
there's a great YouTube video called Why We Don't Need Standards in the Cloud. It's from 2010, though. So like 7 years ago, but still really good watching. And there's a progression in the market, and we're at the part of we barely know what we're doing. And you don't want to standardize what you barely know what you're doing. Otherwise, you wind up with things like Corba or SOAP-ish or WS Splat. Anyway.
I think there's tooling obviously being created, though, to standardize like deployment. And that's essentially with Architect. That was, I think, Brian's original, well, not original, but the outcome of that work. So it's going to happen, kind of. Like, I don't think proper standardization is happening. But, I mean, the tooling is going to dictate, I think, how we deploy, obviously. And, that's what I'm hoping that we can get maybe all on the same page.
Well, you can't really do anything unless you use serverless, because as a developer, you're going insane. You have to be a plumbing PhD unless you have a framework like serverless that does it, right?
Yeah, I do think you have a point, though, that we're going to see common developer experiences and patterns are going to emerge just because developers, if you want to try your product, you say, oh, it's just like setting up this other product, and B, it's just when you get to a point where it's easy for developers to use your product, other people are going to start to copy you, and then it's going to start to kind of grow into this pattern. But yeah, it's not really a standard like you said either. But I do see that there will be a common developer onboarding experience or developer experience for several different platforms.
Yeah, and for me, I think as this gets adopted more widely, especially in larger organizations, I would love to see some standards around change management and how when you're publishing events all the time, different topics, how do you manage that change, those schemas when multiple teams are consuming those and multiple services are consuming those. So I don't know if the panel has any ideas around that, but I've been thinking about that a lot, especially in my current role.
One other thing I've been thinking about is like event sources. I think you were mentioning that, like, how do you standardize that? Right now, webhooks are kind of the standard way, but like Twitter doesn't give you a webhook, right? Facebook doesn't give you a webhook. And I looked at the Azure talk about like all those little like integrations, and they're very proprietary now to like every single different platform, right? So how do we, like, if I'm a startup, how do I make a thingy that like can trigger other people's functions, right? Like, that's something interesting.
Yeah, I think that would go a long way towards integration, right? I think we all talked about our own platforms today, kind of how we all do the same concepts, right? We've got a function or an action, we've got a trigger, we've got data storage services. I think there's going to be a lot more integration between different clouds. So hopefully there is some sort of interoperability, if not a standard, that emerges that helps developers kind of pick and choose what they want to do based on that particular microservice.
Sorry, go ahead. I agree with that, and I think eventually there will be standards because, especially for larger corporations, when they're moving to the cloud, they want a multi-cloud solution. They don't want to just be in Azure. They don't want to just be in AWS, and they want to be able to have it in, multiple clouds for dependency reasons. So I think eventually we'll get there. Just it's not going to be for a while.
Yeah, I think there's really two things that are relevant. I think the first thing that will standardize is going to be the patterns that people use. Like, how do I compose functions? How do I write them? What actually makes sense? What doesn't make sense? And, so the earlier question about what's the biggest barrier, I think the fear of probably making mistakes. People have to be willing to try this and completely understand that it could really bomb and not work. And the second part in terms of standards, I think it's interoperability that's going to be the key more than anything else. And I think the data structures that you pass around between the different functions are going to almost become as important as the code you always write. Because if you think about it, when you write code, you spend a lot of time designing the data structures that you pass from one module to another module. What is the input to a function? What's the output to a function? And I can do that in my favorite programming language, whatever it is, in a way that's idiomatic to that programming language. What is that data interchange format between the different functions that I send back and forth? Is that XML? Absolutely not. We already tried that. is that JSON kind of really ugly? Like, how do I describe schemas? And so it's almost kind of, I don't know if there'll be something that emerges that's a way for you to describe data structures that isn't XML, isn't YAML, isn't JSON, because I hate all of them equally as much. But
and you'll hate the new one too.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we're ready to move on to the next question. Serverless and eventful architectures and their applications are solving organizational challenges, release management, reusability and ownership, operations and run capabilities. What new features do you see emerging in the next 6 months from the serverless space? I see a lot more specialization coming out in IoT, and I already see this happening in AWS with things like Greengrass, focused on IoT. I think now that we've kind of got IoT to the popularity that it's at, I think we're going to see a lot more specialization from providers that are tailoring to specific use cases that turn out to be very popular, because IoT is just booming right now. And so yeah, that's what I see happening in the next 6 months is focusing on rolling out new features that help fit those specialized cases.
Yeah, IoT with what we're doing is huge, and almost every day I'm looking at new different IoT projects, and we're looking at something where you can deploy, in our case, Azure Functions directly to the device and then trigger devices from there, and I know other providers looking at it as well. So yeah, I completely agree with that.
I think that one of the big drivers for this is a marketplace of functions, and everybody has their own, which means there is no marketplace. There's a lot of little siloed marketplaces, but I think you might start seeing something. There's 1,000 flowers blooming with people doing their own kind of tool chain frameworks, or maybe one that covers the catalog space in a cross-cloud way, I think.
I wrote a Lambda function to basically replace Twitter not having webhooks. So the Lambda function just pings the Twitter feed every now and again and just calls another function that I can then set. So it basically just replaces the need for a webhook. But yeah, things like that where if someone else could use it, I would just put it out there and have them use it. Yeah.
So just like marketplace, or essentially NPM for
for Cordova plugins.
It might just be NPM.
Please don't let it be NPM. Please. Anyway.
So we've got, in the OpenWhisk community, we've got basically package spec that's being worked on. It's using YAML, unfortunately, right now. But until the 15th new standard comes out, then we'll start with that one. But I hope that that's kind of a way to package, obviously for the OpenWhisk community, where you have different providers. We've got a Bluemix one, but also as other people deploy OpenWhisk systems on-prem, on their own cloud, whatever system, that you have those packages that you can bring to one or another system, install consistently, and kind of declare what your application is based on what its dependencies are. So hopefully there is some sort of package spec work going on.
We have a question from the audience.
Hi, I'm in a large enterprise system, and I'm just wondering, what are the criteria of a good use case, kind of a low-hanging fruit, that I could think about of moving into a serverless function?
Do you use mainframes or AS400s or anything like that?
No, just a lot of Oracle, big data systems.
So one use case I've been playing with is trying to split the read and writes off these systems that are kind of really expensive, and having that pub sub kind of functionality for read-only services, and continue writing to these really old, expensive services. I think you could find a lot of good use cases there. Also, being in financial services, mainframes, and doing that same pattern there to try to offload the costs of, making KICS calls to the mainframes, because those are super expensive. And so there's overnight settlements. There's lots of interesting cases there. Just as patterns, if you have batch services. No, not necessarily. Maybe pushing it to a queue or a different database that's more lightweight, faster, distributed for read-only purposes. Something that's eventually consistent, so you can just keep pummeling it, like Kassandra, for example, and then
Don't
keep your
pummel me.
and keep your your legacy architecture and all your apps on this whole system, and try to move it away slowly.
There are, I mean, to your point, there are some patterns for legacy modernization that involve these microservice patterns like event sourcing and CQRS you hear about all the time. And what do you do today? You build a microservice, right? It's usually a long-running app. Well, a lot of these you probably could just break down into a bunch of functions and run them. Really, it comes down to, do you have a public cloud provider you want to run it on? Because really, right now, the most mature is going to be Lambda, Azure, and if you're a Node.js shop, you're going to probably be able to do it on Google or on Microsoft Azure. The other ones that are like on-prem, like Kubernetes-based ones, are all very raw and young, like Fission or whatnot. So you have to know, where can I run this? That's the first thing. Is it the data sensitive? The second thing is, is it something that doesn't require a ton of pre-warming on my legacy? Because that often is the problem, is that when you have spiky workloads and stuff like that, the problem isn't the serverless function, it's everything around it. If it's a bunch of legacy, it's not ready. It ain't ready for like the ability to handle the infinite scale, right? So you want something that's modest, that you normally would write as a microservice, but you're just going to say, no, I'm going to try it with this. Just be aware that the development experience today is lumpy. It's not, but so something that is not super important from a time frame perspective, but you want to get the learnings and kick the tires on.
Another thing, if you want like low-hanging fruit, I think everyone covered it here. It's like anything that's asynchronous, on a queue, stateless, right? Like if you have those three things, it's probably a good candidate. If you don't have those three things, it's going to be more work, right?
Oh, yeah. Just to build on the banking use case that you guys, was that on? It's on.
Yeah.
That you were talking about. I think one of the financial tech now, I've heard a couple. We did a POC with a customer. They did some stuff up in the cloud, sync data back to an instance of OpenWhisk on-prem near a mainframe, near other data, to make sure that what's transiting through the system is close to what it's interacting with, and the latency is low. So there's lots of interesting new kind of hybrid, I think, deployment options you now have with some of the open source solutions.
So I'll just continue the topic further, and I would like to, if you guys could, present any strong business drivers, because at the end of the day, businesses have to, buy into this decision of the tech team trying to sort of get into something which is so there is a cost risk, a financial risk, and on the other side there is also a technological risk because it's something new. So how do you convince the business team or the business side of the business, like we should be going serverless, or my tech team is choosing to take this path? Any concrete cases like this will lead into these cost savings, or this will help us sort of bring in more hypotheses, validate more hypotheses, as in?
Nordstrom published some documentation on their move to serverless and the benefits, and I think a few of the issues as well that they went through. So and they're not a small retailer by any measure. So that's one way, is pointing to the successes and issues of other businesses. Another way is baby steps, like we were talking about with the last question, just kind of one by one, just tackling the low-hanging fruit and then seeing the benefits from tackling that and then pushing forward as appropriate. And then there's also just realizing that not everything's going to be serverless. Sometimes you get the hammer nail problem, and so we think everything needs to be serverless. No, not really. But there are things that would benefit from it. And so basically setting expectations realistically and saying, okay, not everything's going to move to serverless, but here are some good candidates, starting by tackling the low-hanging fruit, and then showing the benefits of just taking a few projects and moving them over to serverless. Baby steps, essentially, would be the best way.
Yeah, and I think all the providers, we all have great examples. Like I think, I'm pretty sure Domino's is one of our flagship ones that they use bots and they use Azure functions, and so they have a good serverless story. But when I talk to businesses or even startups, one of the pieces I talk about, a lot I focus on is the cost savings. So it usually does focus on that. But also, too, that it is a rapid development experience. So you could build it and you could fail fast, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. You're not going to invest months and months and months to get a prototype going. You may invest a few hours or a day or two, and it's either going to work, or like you said, it's not going to work. So
I think if you look at a lot of your enterprise applications, you're going to find that there are certain elements of things in them that are limits to scalability, where maybe you have something that consumes too much memory when it runs, but it's not something that runs all the time. Maybe it's something as simple as this application takes file uploads, and I'd rather have a function that uploads that once an upload happened into an object store of some kind, maybe something like S3 or the equivalent from the other clouds, I then trigger my app and say, here's where my file is located. So you could make a case for taking some of these bottlenecks and saying, hey, could I move some of them out of the app? And that way it's low risk and has immediate benefits. Be no reason not to try it out, kind of thing.
Speed is the killer app. If you think about every reason why you see companies all along Bay Street and Front Street here investing in cloud and PaaS and container systems, it's to do things faster at scale safely. And arguably serverless is the next step in that evolution. It's young, but it's like, turning the dial to 11, as they say, on just being able to move fast and not, here's my code, just run it for me, I don't care how. Give me the data, I don't care how you got it to me, just give it to me, make it scalable, make it highly available. That is amazing freedom for developers to just innovate and do things that are core to the business and not worry about the plumbing.
Yeah. Just wanted to touch on that topic too, on being more free and autonomous. This kind of new way of developing services and architecture, especially in large organizations, allows you to really decouple your teams from the traditional system, both in delivery and integration into a brand new cloud platform, and the way you organize your teams as well. Just using that event-based system. So I think that's really powerful for changing how your organization is structured.
I just want to say, selfishly as the organizer, I want to see the panel not always agree with itself. If you guys have different opinions, please don't be shy. We'd love to hear more of those kind of debates and conversations.
I think we're all in agreement here.
I can start an argument really quickly.
Don't.
I don't like semicolons in JavaScript.
Oh, wait. I'm with you on that.
Tabs versus spaces?
We even agree with PHP.
I use 2 spaces for indentation.
Standard JS.
Yeah, I was thinking in the context of serverless, but now you want to flame war it.
You said you wanted an argument.
Yeah. I think what was said about organizational, though, it's key is if your organization is ready to change, right? That's 100%. That's something we've had to learn in this building. That we, the term that gets thrown around a lot is digital transformation. And to me, it's crazy because my background isn't necessarily a whole lot of enterprise. I've worked with some big companies, but to me, it is interesting the problems that are faced by these companies at the organizational level to free themselves to then be able to use these new capabilities. So you potentially are sitting here thinking, this is another year or 2 off. You might be right, and probably are right, and it might even make good business sense to wait before you do a POC so that the tooling and the environment and the ecosystem matures. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to jump on this right now because we're telling you can save some money and it looks good on you internally if you're doing these things. But if your organization's ready to change from the antiquated enterprise systems and architectures you've been working on before, then that's great, and I think you can move on and you can look at this as something that is the right next step. But I think it does deal with organizations.
I do have a legitimate, let's do the audience question. Yeah, it's better.
Hello. So I have a question. When we build a lot of modules in code, especially some of the more statically typed languages, we have a concept of accessibility. So we have public functions that define our API endpoints, something that people are going to consume, and we have internal functions, and those are generally kept internal to allow for further refactoring. With this serverless architecture, how do you define those boundaries, and how do you give yourself enough room to refactor and grow your application?
So, on Google, for example, you can make your public functions HTTP functions, and then your private functions listen to pub subtopics, right? And so you only have authenticated, internal apps can write to those pub subtopics. So that's a good way. And then it's just you can actually use a push topic, which is just an HTTP endpoint, but it puts all the auth and stuff in front of you, and then the public ones are that way. And so because it's separate from the app, right, you can just switch it out with a different function and it just starts reading from the same topic. And I'm sure that all the other clouds have very similar stuff.
As for the refactoring, I think just paying strict attention to where the boundaries between your modules are. Because if you cut the code into two small pieces, you're gonna have to edit like 8 or 9 functions to refactor one thing. But if you've got one large function doing everything, of course, refactoring is going to be a giant pain. So that's true of any architecture, though. When you have a modular system, paying strict attention to the boundaries between your modules is going to help with refactorability and with scalability in a lot of ways if you need to scale up a particular service.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Keeping it as discrete as possible makes it really easy. And to touch on what Adib was saying earlier, just applying those really good programming practices and making sure that your functions are idempotent and you can compose them in different ways and reuse them in different ways and version them using the different clouds are all together really beneficial for keeping your systems easy to refactor.
Yeah, and in terms of accessibility with the public, I think the key part of most of these systems, I know at least it is for IBM Cloud and Bluemix, is there's always an API gateway thing that can be your gateway that handles a lot of your rules, while everything else is basically private to you, and you only kind of expose what you want to expose through those systems. So it is outside the core platform for most of these architectures, and that's kind of the gateway. Both end users and sometimes reusing or exposing services.
Are we out of time? It's 5, so should we have time? Okay, cool. I actually have a question that might actually cause some disagreement and is a legitimate serverless question. So we kind of talked about standards at the beginning. We talked about seeing common patterns. Do you think that all the providers are just going to end up being the same at the end of this, or do you think they're all going to be different? Do you think, it's kind of a look into the future. Like, what do you see? Where do you see your favorite platform? Because we all have a favorite platform here at this. Well, maybe not all of us, most of us. So where do you see it going? Do you see it just being homogenous, like every provider is going to be the same? Do you see specializing in different tactics or different use cases? What do you see for the future for either your platform or one you don't necessarily agree with?
Well, I think what's unique for the IBM context is that this isn't new. We've kind of done the same thing for Cloud Foundry, another open source project, in addition to OpenWhisk, right? Mm-hmm. Cloud Foundry, OpenStack, Kubernetes, a whole bunch of other projects where we were in kind of co-opetition with Pivotal, with other companies. Yeah. So we differentiated on other services, things we did well, cognitive. Right. But we kind of used the underlying platform as kind of the thing we shared, the standard, right? And I think that's where we're going to continue to focus. I think just making sure that Red Hat's going to have their own instance of OpenWhisk. Adobe's going to have it for their own use case. There's going to be integration, small startups, ISVs that do their own thing. So they can all still share the platform, and that's why I think it's got a great strategic future in that everybody has a stake in it, and as long as we're able to build great IoT solutions, for example, that's one of our key focuses. That's different from how Amazon does it. We're going to succeed, and it's going to be hopefully a common use a developer experience on our cloud versus somebody as well as somebody else's.
Yeah, I think that the programming, like each one of the programming communities, whatever language and an environment, is going to converge on a kind of canonical. Here's how you write functions in Java. Here's how you write functions in JavaScript, whatever that is. And then as far as the providers and infrastructure, I honestly think the infrastructure will be completely isolated from you. I should be able to write my function in a way that's not related to anywhere where it runs. But where it runs is really important. How I'm going to get locked into that is all the services that I will need. So if it happens to be the case that, I don't know, Firebase is the database I want to use, I'll be like, where can I get the best Firebase? Or where can I get the best deal for the amount of data that I need to process and the scalability that I'm looking for? So if you look at it from the point of view of, I don't know, probably AWS has made more money off of MySQL and Postgres than any company in the MySQL and Postgres space because they're selling you that as a service. So I think the services are where it's going to be really, really different. More than anything else, and it's where you're going to get tied up and not able to be portable.
you get into this weird situation with higher level abstractions where people seem to, at least in the enterprise, they have a hard time wrapping their head around it and not wanting to adopt it until they can touch and feel it. So I actually think that there's an open question. Obviously, serverless can be very successful, with Lambda and with Azure and with Google Cloud Function, all this, and OpenWhisk. But it's when people can actually, things like OpenWhisk and things like, like Skates and these things where you can touch and feel them and install them, like, for your box huggers, where they can go, ooh, it's running on my vSphere cluster, right? Because those people are not retired yet, and they won't be retired for another 10, 15 years, right? So I think that there is a whole mindset thing about, like, the entire IT industry that is going to wrap their head around this. And so I think you're going to see innovation. And can I run my own serverless thing, or do I have to use this blob in the sky? That's one area. Another one is interop, right? Is there going to be some movement about, can we make, we've been pretty lazy about REST APIs for a while. I mean, is the end all and be all really Swagger, really? Like, can we move, So there's going to be innovation around that, too, because we're going to be doing most of these functions calling each other, right? So those are two areas that come to mind.
To remove the age from your argument, hardware developers like to touch and feel things too, of any age, really. So it's not just developers that may retire in 10 to 15 years. There's whole categories of developers that might fit that.
Good point.
Just to
no,
kind
you're
of
right.
lighten that up.
You're absolutely right.
It's really loud. All right, so one last thing. I think, like, if you want to, I don't know what the future is going to be for different clouds, but if you look at VMs, you think, oh, VMs are all the same, right? Like EC2 and Google Compute Engine, it's all the same, but it's really not, right? If you go to Amazon, you can get like giant VMs that Google doesn't have. Google has like ridiculous networking. Azure has Azure Stacks, you can run the same thing on-prem. They're all different, even though they all run Ubuntu, right? At the end of the day, it's like the same operating system, the same packages, but they're all a little bit different. And so I don't know how they're going to be different, but like the thing that matters is going to be the same, that differentiators are going to be different. It's like, it's going to be similar to that. I think
the services surrounding it, or what's going to,
or like the core competencies of the platform are slightly different, even though the product is the same. Right. That kind of makes sense.
Y'all are too agreeable. I tried to start spark debate. I tried. Let it be known, I tried. Do we have any more audience questions?
One last audience question.
Yep.
Before I go to the audience, Stu, I have to do my duty as an ex-member of the Open API initiative. It's not called Swagger, it's called the Open API spec. We worked hard on renaming that. Nobody's calling it that. It's been renamed to the Open API spec. Anyways,
and
audience
nobody
question.
calls it that. Fight me.
There's a disagreement.
Don't at me.
What do you think the next step is going to be for compiled languages and performance around those? How do you think that's going to be approached? Things like everything from Go, Rust to Java, and do you see any different approaches there?
What's the question? Can you repeat that one more time?
What do you think the next step is going to be for compiled languages in serverless? So over and above shims and the things we have today.
I mean, I would personally expect that Java will be just fine. If you look at some of the stuff, like in Java 9, they have ahead-of-time compilation. They have JLink, which lets you produce really tiny GREs. And I'd expect, like, in any kind of, if you look at it, like, things like the GRE and the CLR and all these types of environments were designed where I start it up, I don't care how long it takes to start up, and then it transfers for a really long time. But there's nothing stopping the designers of these runtimes from optimizing them for usage in a serverless infrastructure. Once the infrastructures are more clear of how they actually work underneath, I think those will just come.
If you look at Go, for example, I mean, it was invented at Google to solve Google problems, and just turns out that other people have the same problems. And it was designed to make small binaries that can scale ridiculously quickly, right, running on Borg. And so Kubernetes does the same thing when it was like scaling quickly, and functions is built on top of Borg, I mean, at the end of the day, right? And so it's designed to run compiled applications. I mean, C++, Java, and Go are the main languages at Google, right? They're all ahead of time compiled. And so if you look at my demo, you saw that we were compiling everything in the cloud. It's because that's how we do things at Google already, and so it's kind of natural. And I'm sure the other providers will all like have the same support. I don't see it being slower or faster because it's compiled.
So one thing that I see compiled, like just because you're using that word, is I expect personally to see compiled to functions, whatever that is. Maybe it's workflow systems that will compile the steps to functions, and they'll be like, this other thing that you work with that's a GUI tool of some kind that's going to say, I can compile you to Lambda AWS Lambda functions or Google or Azure or whatever it is.
I was going to say, just adding to that, it's less in my mind about performance and what's going to be the most highly efficient language to use. I think there's still going to be what the developer used to that language? Are they familiar with it? That's what they're going to go with. They're used to doing it a certain way, taking what they already know, bringing that to a serverless world. There's going to be languages they're already comfortable with. There's ecosystems of packages, tools they already use. So although performance is great for certain use cases, I think having the choice that, okay, I want to use JavaScript in this context. I want to use PHP in this context. I like the idea of mod PHP, totally stateless. That's just what I'm familiar with, and I'm using some certain libraries there. But and Java in different contexts for different reasons. I think as long as you have language choice, we'll see what happens, right? People will develop successful applications based on those languages for specific domains, and then see what works best rather than kind of saying, an event.
So I'm going to slightly disagree. So I'll be the first one.
All right, here we go. Let's do it.
I think there's a lot of value in having strongly typed languages running in functions, especially when you're doing a lot of composability between them. It makes things a lot easier. And maybe if we have more things like with standard lib is building right with the fastlang and some type safety around there, we can make that a lot easier with interpolated languages. But without those kind of things, I think we may end up creating some debt in one way or another, or orchestrating these functions in ways that makes it very hard to use.
True. I would agree, though, that's not specific to serverless. I mean, it's exactly, and it's going to depend on the use case, right? Do you need speed? Do you need, just freedom? Do you need safety? It's going to depend. There's not one size fits all serverless function.
So I'll make a very controversial statement. I think serverless will just die. And I mean it in the sense of, if you had a really smart container scheduler, like on the level of what the JIT does internally, I shouldn't have to think about throwing stuff up as functions. What if I just had a platform where I could say, here's my code, run it for me. It's not a function, but that thing was smart enough to figure out how to pause my resources and bill me and scale me. Because what people are really looking for from functions is the theory of the infinite scalability. I kind of question how many apps really need that infinite scalability, and is it really infinite until you run into the coda from your cloud provider? So is it possible that the container schedulers might grow features that reduce the need of needing to go to functions? So you wanted controversy, right?
Yeah. I'm going to also disagree with the typed languages. I think it's typed messages. So like gRPC or Captain Proto or whatever the Facebook one is, it's like you can't just send random stuff, right? Because then it's just going to break.
I hate schemas and I hate typed languages.
Yeah. I mean,
no, really.
Make it slower.
Yes, you have to. You have to. If you want evolvable, you don't want to. We killed ourselves with XML, building data bindings that fit the message. There are ways to build data bindings that are extensible, but nobody does them because nobody has time. So this is the only thing with strongly typing, is it says, here's my message for all time, and 24 years from now I'm going to be crying because it's the same message type, but I have to add fields to it. That's all I'm saying.
Well, then you also have, and at Pivotal you should be familiar with the cloud contracts kind of idea, where you can kind of make the migration a little bit simpler, but I kind of have to agree that, yeah.
It's like there's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
That's why we have jobs, right? I mean, if everything just worked magically, we would be out of jobs, right?
Yeah. If it were smart enough to run our code and understand what it was doing, it could probably write it better, and then we would all be unemployed and or dead by Skynet. So, yeah.
Who needs compilers when you can write unit tests, right?
Wow. Should we keep going? Okay. Any of y'all have a question y'all want to ask the panel? Because I've asked all the questions on the sheet of paper.
I think we had suggested, what do you see in 6 months, a year down the road?
That was one of the questions, yes.
Yeah. So, and I think this is the same thing, right? So I mentioned the serverless working group at CNCF, right? What I think we've seen from that work is that generation 1 of serverless has been, all right, this is awesome, getting your head around the capabilities, the scalability, the cost model, writing functions, doing that. But then I think there's still a missing piece of, well, in order to get those benefits, I have to cross this chasm where I have to learn a new programming model or do something differently and deal with a different debugging situation that I wasn't used to before. What we need now, I think, are lots more positive use cases. And I think that's the big thing that's going to come out of the next year is we'll see we've seen some use cases, right, out there, people successfully using serverless, doing things drastically cheaper, faster, whatever. But I think the next year holds that you're going to see a lot more, some of these enterprise use cases come out too, where there's been a 10x improvement in something for some specific use case, and it kind of runs away as the key thing. IoT is kind of going there. But I think that's kind of what's on the horizon now. Is just seeing now the concepts, the mental, model is there. Okay, let's see what people have done with it.
Yeah, it's funny. I think the main reason IoT likes serverless providers especially so much is we kind of tripped over our own feet with the whole security issue, like with the DNS denial of service attack that happened because of a bunch of unsecured WS2812 Wi-Fi chips. I think the security that serverless provides in the form of providers that then provide that security is really why one of the main reasons IoT is just flocking to serverless is it's like, oh great, okay, so someone else is in charge of security and it's not me, and that abstraction that you get, anyway.
So we talked about benefits, or essentially how you are going to differentiate. I actually was super impressed by IBM's Watson and Bluemix when I went to Interconnect, and has nothing to do with the fact that they brought me out there to do that. But I see that those kinds of services, again, I think we touched on it earlier. Obviously, that those kind of services are the things that could potentially be the competitive advantage. But again, to wrap up that conversation, which I think everybody agreed is the baseline's going to be there, and then there's going to be these other things that we're going to continue to go to, let's say AWS or whoever, to offer this capability. So.
Yeah, I think we're good. So thank y'all. Thank you, panel members, and thank you, audience.
All right. Thank you to our panelists and speakers. Thank you to all the attendees in the audience. I also want to again thank our groups and communities in Toronto that helped us put this event together. Thank you, TechMasters, Full Stack TO, Node School, Functional TO, Dev TO, lots of TOs. This one is different. Toronto JS, flipped the acronyms there. And especially thank you to my employer, TELUS, and especially the TELUS Digital team for helping us organize and host this event. Thank you, everybody.
Can we get a round of applause for you as well?
Yes, thank you.